Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new event of the Middle East Institute. As you can see, this is a hybrid format. We're going to have a discussion with Dr. Jonathan Fulton in a few minutes. He's on his way, but due to the traffic in Singapore on a Friday afternoon, he should join us in about 5 minutes. So please stay with us while he's on his way. Just a few words on the event itself and the speaker. This is going to be a discussion on China's perception in the Arab world. We've been discussing about that topic in several events in the past, and we have the opportunity to discuss that with one of the most prolific writers on the topic of China's Middle East policy. This is a topic that has been in the air for a long time, but more importantly, maybe because of China's involvement in the last two to 3 years in the Middle East, be it for its mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year, or more recently, China's engagement with Gulf states through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS arrangement. One thing which will be at the center of the discussion with Jonathan Fulton is the topic of how Arab states and Middle Eastern countries perceive the role of China. And you can see right with me, Dr. Fulton, and this is the perfect opportunity for me now to introduce our speaker. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us, and my apologies for the traffic in Singapore. Jonathan is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. He's also serving as an associate professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. As I said, he's an expert on Chinese policy toward the Middle East, published several books on that, such as, for instance, China's relations with the Gulf monarchies, and the co-editor with Li Chen-Sim, another good friend of the Institute, of a book, External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies, published by Routledge. Let me also add that he received his PhD from the University of Leicester on the topic of Chinese relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council member states. So he did not start to work on China when the topic became cool. The topic became cool because he worked on that. So without further ado, dear Jonathan, as I said to our audience, the center of this discussion that we wanted to have with you is your recent work on how the Arab world perceives the role of China, perceives China in recent years. So my understanding is that this is overall a rather positive perception. So we would like you to maybe unpack the findings of your research so far on the perceptions of China in the Arab world. How do you understand that positive view? What would be, in your opinion, the driver of the Arab perceptions on China? I think we can start on that. And let me also add to our audience that if you'd like later on to ask a question, please write your question in the chat box to MEI events, and we will collect them during the Q&A session later during the event. Thank you very much. Jonathan, floor is yours.
Thanks, Raul. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back. I haven't been to Singapore since the last time I spoke at MEI in 2019, so pre-pandemic. So really happy to be back. Yeah, when you talk about positive views of China, it's kind of more complicated than just positive or negative. So I did a project in 2022-23 where I went to Egypt, Israel, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi, and basically said in each partnering institute, just bring together all the smartest China watchers in your city, in your country, and let's have a conversation about how you see China affecting your country's interests, your economy, your political situation, the strategic environment. And they're really interesting conversations. It was a really cool project to do. The big takeaway was there are very few China watchers in any of those places, except Israel has a pretty good, vibrant China studying community. The other places, you just don't see it very much yet. So I think that's why I say I don't really like the idea of it being positive or negative, because I think it's not fully baked yet. There's a lot of, you can see people in Egypt, for example, we're mostly talking about China from the perspective of what they don't like about the West. So they'd say, look, we're getting very little support from the West. Nobody's coming in here and trading or investing. We're not getting a lot of support on things that are really important to us. And China comes in and no conditionality. They come in and they, put a lot of money into our ports. They're helping us build the national capital district, and they're our biggest trading partner. And that happens a lot. But when you ask, more deep level questions about their knowledge of China, their experience with China, their formal study of it, there's almost nothing there. So I think typically people would speak of it in pretty positive terms, but they also would speak of it from not fully informed terms. So at my university in Abu Dhabi, for example, we don't have an area studies program at all. Nobody's studying any specific region or country. We have like an international studies program, and we don't have any formal classes on China whatsoever. And China is by far the UAE's biggest trading partner. You'd think that they would be formally working on it, but you don't see that very much yet. Some of the things that I'd often hear, again, like it's often presented as an alternative to the West, whereas there's a lot of kind of not so positive views in the region recently of the West. But at the same time, at my university, everything's being taught in English. Most students, if they're going to study overseas, they're going to go to the UK, which is the preferred destination, or they're going to go to the US. Very few people are going to China for tourism, for studies, for really much of anything. So it does seem, one person said, I thought it was quite interesting. They said, look, our partners are in the West, primarily the US, and our customers are in the East. And those relationships are still quite transactional at this stage. I think that will evolve. This is all early days. But when people think about China, it's really just a matter of, look, you do a lot of trade with us, you do a lot of investment with us. There's never been a colonial experience with China in the Middle East. And, typically China stays out of the politics. Again, I think what's interesting about that is this idea that China stays out of the politics. I think, again, because people aren't formally studying China in the region, there's not really a very deep awareness of how China operates as a international relations actor. I think a lot of Asian countries, for example, have realized that, yeah, China can be your number one trading partner, and it can be a very useful partner in other areas. But if you bump up against what China calls its core interests, things like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, South China Sea, Taiwan, if your interests with China diverge on any one of those issues, you're going to get the sharp end of the economic statecraft. It's not going to go very well. And in the Middle East at this point, those issues don't really register with local publics or governments. So there's no real threat of those things threatening the relationship. But again, you can see how things might change.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in this first comments. Let me first ask you about the fact that you have a limited knowledge in the Arab world. Do you see any nuance between the different regions of the Arab world? Let's say that in the Gulf, in the Levant, or in North Africa. My assumption is that countries such as Saudi Arabia or the UAE, which have these very strong and increasing ties with China, may have a better understanding by now of China than other countries that have much more limited engagement with China. How do you see these nuances?
Not so much, strangely. So what you see is in those countries that you just mentioned, the Gulf countries mostly, because they have more wealth, if the people who would be going to study in China would prefer to go, like I said, study in the UK or the US, what you see is students from Egypt, from Yemen, from Syria, from less wealthy or less prosperous countries are sending their graduate students using these kind of Belt and Road scholarship programs. So they'd be going to China, they'd be studying about it, and they would be learning the language, they'd be building those kind of personal and professional networks there. So yeah, it doesn't really play out the way you'd expect. One of the places, or one of the issues where you see this divide, it's been very interesting. I don't know if you saw this last week. The UAE released a white paper on AI, and in this white paper, they said the U.S. is by far our most important strategic partner in this domain. And I think that took a lot of people off guard because, of course, the story for several years has been Chinese tech. And of course, this has been kind of putting them at odds with the US because the US has made a pretty big issue of this. But the UAE's biggest tech firm, G42, announced in December that they weren't going to work with Chinese AI companies anymore. They're going to work with Microsoft. I think we're seeing that across the Gulf, basically countries that have the resources to pay. I mean, Microsoft has been doing amazing work in this space. And I think there's a concern that Chinese companies are kind of potentially compromised by the relationship with the party at home. So if the party's having a hard time with these companies, then maybe we should also keep them a bit at arm's length. And if you can afford the best in class, then you should pay for the best in class. So you're seeing that in the Gulf. Whereas in the North Africa, there's a lot of big decisions coming in the next few months about 5G and AI. And I think what we're seeing is in those countries, because especially in Egypt, where the economy has really been very, very not so good, is a diplomatic way to say it, I guess. What Egypt is relying on, of course, they need foreign capital, and that's not coming from, say, American private investors, because they look at it as a corrupt environment or a place where it's very hard to operate. So I think what you're seeing is in countries like Egypt or in its neighbors in North Africa, they're saying, look, Chinese capital doesn't have the same kind of concerns. So they're much more inclined to work with China on these tech issues. The price point works, the political conditions work, the fact that they don't have to worry about profit margins for private investors makes it easier. So I think what we're seeing is kind of this bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, where the wealthier countries are kind of returning to what they've always been doing. That's working with, the West in general, the US in particular, still maintaining good relations with China, but not at the level I think that people were expecting over the past few years. And then the less well-off countries seem to be turned towards China.
It's interesting that you mentioned the recent decisions of a country like the UAE, in particular, this decision from December to stop its cooperation on AI with China, because in a sense that goes against some of the assumptions that the ongoing war in Gaza is triggering a lot of frustrations, not just in the UAE, but across the Arab world. And one assumption is that this is actually going to deepen the relations between the Arab world and China. Do you see that causation, or do you think actually, no, there's a disconnect between that frustration because of what's happening in Gaza and the way those countries look at their own partnerships between US and China?
This one could take a while.
We have more than an hour.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think when you look at what China's been doing politically in the region over the past few years, there's a couple of different layers that I think are important. One is that China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping hasn't been very good. Under from Deng Xiaoping forward, the idea was to build strong relationships with the countries that you want to do business with and trade with and study with and learn from. And that's resulted in, China having the economy booming and very good relations with, Europe and Japan and Korea and the US and Australia and Canada and all these kind of developed countries. What we saw during the last 10 years, this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy and the deterioration in a lot of those relationships has resulted in suddenly this China as the champion of the global South, where you hear all these, new initiatives saying, look, we're all about the global development, global security, global civilization development or initiatives, trying to establish China as an alternative to global governance that's not based on liberal Western norms. So I think a lot of their outreach to these countries has been based on this new outlook, and I think this new outlook is largely one of, I wouldn't say failure, but kind of it's been a not very productive foreign policy over the past decade or so. So when China hosted the Saudis and the Iranians last, in March 23 for the rapprochement, that was what the foreign minister at the time, Jinping, said was, this is an example of the global security initiative in action. Most people in the Middle East never heard of the global security initiative at this point. It's kind of like when the Belt and Road was announced and nobody, showed up in every joint communique, but nobody really knew what it was at the time. So China was trying to develop this kind of legitimacy or credibility for this initiative that was really establishing its bona fide as an alternative to the West. And then you could see when Mahmoud Abbas visited last spring and they invited Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they said, we're going to try to sort out the Israel-Palestine issue. And it was all based on this idea, look, we can do things that the West can't. And then October 7th happened, and that didn't work, right? Those normative principles that underline these initiatives, basically about peace through development, which is a really important pillar, but it's not the only pillar. You need peace through actual traditional security as well. And when this horrific attack happened on October 7th, China didn't really have much to offer, When Israel responded, China didn't really have much to offer Palestine. There's been a lot of rhetoric about what they would like. There's been engagement through the United Nations Security Council, but it hasn't come with any results. Now, for folks in the Middle East, when they're looking at this, I think there was this perception when you saw the Riyadh summit in December 22 and the Raisi visit to Beijing a couple months later, and the rapprochement and the BRICS and the SCO membership for these Middle Eastern countries, and the foray brief into Israel-Palestine peace, all of this stuff signaled to people in the region that, hey, China's ready to, it's been developing or accumulating all this political capital through its economic presence for decades. We've always said, people in the Middle East have always said, when are you going to actually use some of this political capital and start playing a larger role? And that was the sense, I think, was finally, now we can see what this is going to look like. And then there's a massive event and nothing. So I think people were disappointed because there was a sense that China was going to be a major extra-regional power, and it didn't. And then when the Red Sea shipping crisis with the Houthi attacks, this, I think, further solidified that. Especially if you look at, Egypt and Saudi, two comprehensive strategic partners for China, two of their most important Middle Eastern partners. These countries were, very, very adversely affected by this attack or the series of attacks. For Saudi, everything that Saudis talk about is Saudi Vision 2030. Any question you ask in Saudi, the answer is Vision 2030. And what that requires is it requires foreign direct investment and foreign businesses and coming in and setting up shop and helping them build post-hydrocarbon economies and industries, jobs of the future. And that requires stability, which is why I think the Saudis were animated to establish a stronger relationship with Iran. Now, when the Red Sea is under attack the way it was, this and the Houthis went from being on the path towards a better relationship with its neighbors, and then suddenly outright hostile again. This dramatically affected the Saudis' interests. And I didn't talk to anybody in the Saudi government while this is happening, but from other folks living in Riyadh, working in Riyadh, saying there was a lot of frustration with that China did nothing. We rolled out the purple carpet for you. We thought you were going to do something for us. And then at our moment of need, you said, hey, our ships aren't being attacked. Our ships can still traverse the Red Sea, so it doesn't really affect us. And I think it reminded folks of Donald Trump's response to the attack on Saudi Aramco in the fall of 2019, when he said, hey, that was an attack on us. That was an attack on the Saudis. If you want us to help you, pay for it. So I think there's this sense, we bought into this narrative of China as an alternative great power, and it turns out you're just as self-interested as everybody else. And that means you're not really willing to do stuff when the region needs it. So I think people have been kind of contrary to where you were going with the question. I think there was a sense that, hey, everybody's so frustrated with the West and its support for Israel and what it's seen as doing nothing for Palestine all the time, and China and its rhetoric presenting itself as a different type of actor. And then in the end, like, well, nothing really came out of China's role in Saudi and Iran. They haven't done much on Israel-Palestine, if anything. And on the Red Sea, they did nothing. There was even a story about China sending warships to the Red Sea, and everybody went, "Oh, finally, we're seeing something." But really, it was just these were ships that were already scheduled to go in support of its anti-piracy mission. So they were going to Djibouti anyway, and they didn't do anything about the Houthi attacks on shipping. So I think folks have had kind of a lesser view of China as an extra-regional actor in the past few months.
But on the Red Sea issue, in this case, because I'm curious, after the announcement, I think 10 days ago, of China non-aggression pact or non-aggression gentleman's agreement with the Houthis, was there a surprise, you think, from the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia? Was there frustration, actually, that China was very openly just dismissing or downplaying any regional leadership and looking only for the protection of its own ships?
Yeah, I don't think there's any great surprise. So around the same time, there was a photo op with a Chinese ambassador with the leader of Hamas in Doha, where they're both looking into the camera. The Chinese diplomat kind of looks like he's smiling, and you go, my goodness, this is not going to resonate very well with leaders in the Gulf, right? Among leaders in the Gulf, Hamas has always been considered a terrorist organization. So I think when they see China saying, look, we're going to reach out to Hamas and we're going to reach out to the Houthis, it doesn't really, establish it as a very credible extra-regional actor.
So that leads us to a second gap in a way, because what you describe is the gap between expectations, perceptions on the Arab side regarding China's role and the reality, which is much more limited. The other gap I'd like to discuss with you is the US perception of those Arab-Chinese relations and the growing Chinese presence in the Middle East. You've been working with the Atlantic Council in DC for a while. So what is your view? Because you're looking at this topic from the region, and a lot of that probably you have to explain it also to an American audience, which emphasizes mostly the great power competition. What is your view on the potential gap on the US side with regards to this Chinese expansion in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's really frustrating because I'm not from the US. So when I'm talking to American actors, it's not because I'm trying to get a position in administration. I'm an academic from Canada. So nobody in Canada cares about this stuff except me. I think I'm probably the only Canadian in the world who's really deeply engaged on this. So it's not like this is a great career maker for me, right? To get a job in the government back home either. So when I'm talking to the Americans, it's mostly trying to be kind of that bridge to say, look, I've been watching this pretty closely for quite a while. I can explain it in a way that maybe hopefully provides some value. Because what I see, the analysis coming out of the US, it's very politicized. You get a lot of people who look at it and they see everything, like you said, through the lens of great power competition. China's coming into our region and messing it up. And it's, China's 25-year, $400 billion deal with Iran is going to create an axis of revisionism that is going to upend the status quo. And all of this really kind of headline thinking, and in case it did come through when I said the 25-year, $400 billion, 200, whatever it is, that was total sarcasm because it's not real, right? They have a partnership agreement with Iran. They have the same one with the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Algerians, and the Egyptians. And of the five, the Iranian one is probably, well, I wouldn't say it's the least mature, probably Algeria's is the least mature, but Iran's is deeply, deeply underdeveloped compared to the Saudis and the Emiratis. So, and I guess that's an interesting point from an American perspective is China's deepest engagement in the Middle East is with US allies and partners. China's interests in the Middle East align very neatly with America's interests in the Middle East. If you look at what China wants, first and foremost, China's there to do business. It's not there to change things. It's there to take advantage of an area where they get a lot of energy, they do a lot of contracting, and they do a lot of trade. But, so things like maritime security is important for China. Things like getting energy out to global markets is important to China. I think the only big difference between the US's main interest in the region and China's is Israel, where China doesn't have anywhere near the same type of, vision of Israel's importance to the region as the US does. But what that means to me is that you can see a situation where their interests really line up in a pretty important region. If the politics on a broader scale weren't so difficult between the two, you could imagine them saying, hey, we could coordinate policy on things like Iran or on Syria or on Yemen or whatever, to make sure that we both get what we need out of the region. But I think domestically in the US and domestically in China, leaders have painted themselves into a corner by identifying each other as their primary competitors and using them as something to drum up domestic political support. And I also think that their interests in other important regions, like here in Southeast Asia, for example, really don't line up very neatly. And that means that it's hard to say, let's go in isolation and work in the Middle East, where in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia or South Asia, we just really don't see eye to eye at all.
Yeah, you mentioned Israel, and this leads me to a question on the possible differences we see between the Arab world and the non-Arab countries in the Middle East. You mentioned earlier the fact that in the end, you don't see major differences in the level of understanding, level of knowledge on China from, let's say, North Africa to the Gulf. What about countries such as Israel, Turkey, or Iran? And maybe more importantly, Israel and Iran, which I assume are the biggest, the most important countries here for relations with China. Do you see those countries cultivating a much more advanced China policy, a better understanding of China as a regional actor?
From an academic perspective, yeah, you see like really good scholarship being done in both of those countries about China, really advanced levels of Chinese studies, Chinese language studies, travel. I think they've definitely identified it as more important at that level. I don't know if it's resulted in a better policy, but certainly I think they have a more nuanced or more clear-eyed view of how China fits into their bigger overall agenda. So in Israel, it's interesting because there was this period of about it lines up pretty neatly with Netanyahu years, when he's having trouble with the Democrats in the US, then all of a sudden he's Xi Jinping's best friend. And this culminated in 2017 when they announced this new type of partnership. So I mentioned the comprehensive strategic partnerships that China has. And then there's the strategic partnership, and then there's the friendly partnership. And Israel, as far as I know, is the only country that has a comprehensive, innovative partnership. And they signed this in 2017. And the idea was that the two countries were going to work mostly on tech. There's going to be a lot of cooperation on tech stuff. And a few months after that, also in 2017, the US announced it or released its national security strategy, which brought great power competition into everybody's lexicon. And in Israel, of course, when Israel thinks about the US and China, Netanyahu was trying to basically get America's attention by flirting with China. It's more than that, obviously, because China helped with the port in Haifa. But Israel first went to the US and asked for the US to help them build that port. So I think Israel was looking at China as, this is maybe get Washington's attention. As soon as the US released this national security strategy, you saw Israel kind of say, well, if it's going to come down to this, obviously our relationship with the US is existential, our relation with China is transactional. And you saw a lot of stepping back from that Israel-China relationship. I made a couple of trips to Israel in 22, and in one of them, I was there with some folks from the Atlantic Council. We were talking to people, some Israelis, about how the perception from Washington was that Israel's getting too close to China. And the Israelis were saying, if you'd been here 5 years ago, that might have been the case. But one thing they said was, first, on the tech space, what we realized is that in most of the Middle East, China is a seller. And most Arab countries are buyers in the tech sphere. Israel's a seller too. Israel's not buying Chinese stuff. What they saw was it's more of a competitive relationship in the tech space. And there were deep concerns in Israel about their intellectual property being compromised by working closely with Chinese companies, which is a problem I think a lot of other countries have if they're if they've developed an advanced tech ecosystem. The other thing was Israel does a lot of business with a lot of other countries, like everybody does, and a lot of those countries are going to be reluctant to work with you if you're partnering with China on a lot of tech stuff. So these Israeli tech companies kind of, through their own logic, said this is going to hurt us in other ways if we work too closely with China. So they've been building some distance already before October 7th. China is Israel's biggest trade partner. I think Israel is between like 39 and 42 in terms of export and imports for China. It's not a major market for China. And as such, I think China says, hey, we can play politics with Israel. It's pure geopolitics. With a Western country like France or Canada or the US, where there's a huge Jewish population and a huge Arab population, what happens in the Holy Land is a very big domestic political issue in our constituencies. China doesn't have that, right? There's nobody voting, but there's certainly nobody voting on the issue of Israel and Palestine. They're not going to go to their leaders and canvass them or lobby them about this issue. So it's a very geopolitical issue. China can look at Israel and say, you're one country that will always be with the US, whereas Palestine will bring the 22 Arab League countries into a bloc, perhaps, when we go to the UN and say we want to vote on certain issues that matter to us. So by kind of throwing Israel under the bus and going to Israel or going to Palestine, there's this idea that they're getting more support from the broader Arab world. So I think Israel's pretty clear-eyed about China. Iran, I think, is even more so because they don't have anybody else, right? Iran, the asymmetry is the defining feature of this bilateral relationship, and it has been for a long time. And when Iran needs something, China looks at it and says, well, what's our relationship with Washington like today? You know, so when China signed this partnership with Iran back in 2016, in January 2016, they announced comprehensive strategic partnership. They're going to be doing $600 billion worth of trade in a decade. All these big things they're going to do. This was not a coincidence. This was the first head of state visit after the JCPOA was signed. China worked behind the scenes a lot with Iran, saying, you know, if you do this thing that you're not very excited about doing, you can expect a lot more investment and infrastructure and trade and tech, and we're going to help you do a lot of things. China gets to look like a significant diplomatic actor on a tough issue, gets support from the other negotiating countries. So there was quite a bit of momentum in the China-Iran bilateral in early 2016. What happened in late 2016? Same thing as I just said with Israel. In late 2016, Donald Trump was elected president. And when obviously foreign policy didn't feature very significantly in his campaign, but the two things he talked about were the JCPOA is the worst deal signed in history, and I'm going to throw it away. And China is mugging us every day. And I think China looked at its relationship with the US with its, $600 billion of trade every year. And they looked at its relationship with Iran with its $12 billion worth of trade and said, sorry, Tehran, we'll come back to you later. And they really didn't come back to Tehran until you saw things like the trade war and maximum pressure when the US pulled out unilaterally of the JCPOA and Wang Yi, the Chinese FM, said, don't do this. This is an important deal. And the US clearly didn't care. Macron said the same thing. The US didn't care. And then implemented this maximum pressure campaign in which, Saudi Aramco is getting blown up, and ships in Fujairah are getting mined, and Soleimani is being assassinated. All of these really tense events were happening around that time. And living in the Gulf, I've been there since 2006. This was the only time I felt in jeopardy. It felt like this was leading to a conflict. And in that case, I imagine the people in Beijing looked at it and said, we have significant interest in this region, and they're not being undermined necessarily by Iran. They're being undermined by Iran's response to a maximalist foreign policy from the US that threatens our interests. And that's when you saw China start to reach out to Iran more and talk about bringing them into the SCO and operationalizing this partnership. So I think in Iran, they've got this sense like China works with us when it benefits them, and then they throw us away when it doesn't. There's been a frustration with the trade in oil because Iran's been giving them a pretty significant discount in this oil that's supposed to not be traded. And there was a story in January where the Iranians said, look, we're not satisfied with this deal anymore. We want to, raise the price because you're getting a lot of stock and not paying very much for it. And we're not getting what we need. So there's a bit of tension in that bilateral too. And Turkey, of course, will always be the issue of Xinjiang. The Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic people. Erdogan has to speak to that whenever he speaks to China. And of course, every time he does, it just makes the relationship that much tenser. So there's, I think, a ceiling on what Turkey and China can do just because of that domestic political issue.
That actually begs a question also for the Arab world, and that maybe our audience would be curious to hear about, because as you mentioned, the Uyghur, the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur has been a major issue, at least in the West. That's framing, that is shaping a lot of the discussions on China. What about the Arab world? For instance, countries such as Saudi Arabia, do they look at the treatment of the Uyghur and they downplay that because of real politic considerations? How the perception of the Uyghur issue impacts or not their policy towards China?
Not. Yeah. I think there's several layers that partially that explain this. I had a discussion with a lot of Emirati, not a lot, but a group of Emiratis last month about UAE-China relations. And there was kind of an agreement among the Emiratis saying, look, we hear how the West in your media talks about us. And we don't believe that because we know us and you promote a lot of propaganda about us. When we hear you talking about China, we just assume it's the same thing. So whatever message is being promoted is often seen with quite a skeptical lens. Now, I think what's more specific to the Arab world is, especially in the Gulf, media is mostly state-owned. You don't see a lot of private media, and so a lot of what's being reported is being reported by the state, and the state has an interest in maintaining a good relationship with China. So a lot of people aren't at the public level. A lot of people aren't aware of this. It's not an issue that resonates because people just generally, you have to go out of your way. Typically, maybe read the New York Times or Der Spiegel or something if you want to get this news. And most people don't do that. I mean, that's not unique to them. It's when I go home to Eastern Canada and talk to my friends and family about the Gulf, they're like, oh, that's nice. Most people don't care too much about what's happening far away, right? And that comes, I think, to the next point, which I mentioned earlier, core interests. Xinjiang is a core interest for China. Anything that undermines its domestic cohesion is a potential issue. And I think Gulf countries also have, they don't call it the same thing, but I think they have their core interests, and I think they're also mostly domestic issues, right? We need, in a state where there's not a lot of public participation or popular participation in governance, you have to be really aware of how people are sensitive to certain issues. So I think there's a sense like, look, when when I went to Doha, I heard this so many times, people complain about the protesters during the World Cup.
Mhm.
And first they thought I was from the US, so that's always going to be tough. But they kept saying, you guys in the US, you kept like embarrassing us with your rainbow flags and, all of this, trying to, talk about all the bad stuff that you think we do here. And you put this all over the internet and all over these newspapers. And the first thing I said was like, I think you've got it wrong. Nobody in North America cares about football. So it wasn't the Americans, trust me. It's probably the French were doing. Blame those guys. But they say, and I think there's an element of truth to this. They say, look, Western civil society or non-government organizations will constantly come into our region and come up to those red lines and maybe go over them. And sometimes they do it to embarrass us, and sometimes they do it to curry favor with folks back home or to make points. But in any case, you're doing it at our expense. And China doesn't do that. So when China doesn't do that for us, why would we do that on their domestic political issues? Especially on something like Xinjiang, which they'll say, look, it's far away. I think the geopolitical aspect of it, like I said, these are Turkic people, and the relationship between Turkey and the Saudis and the Emiratis and most of the Sunni Arab countries has been pretty problematic since the Arab Spring. There's been kind of this competition for who's going to lead the Sunni world. And I think it played into, the Saudis' hands to say, look, if you care about this issue, go bug Erdogan about it, because he's the guy who you should be talking to. They're Turks. He's a Turk. He's the leader of them. So I think there's a lot of different layers, but I think the big one is a lack of this. You don't hear about this issue. People don't consider it something especially important to their day-to-day lives. Everybody, of course, is thinking more about jobs and economic security, and is the region going to blow up today? Is Hezbollah going to get involved? Are the Houthis going to up it? So it really seems as something quite abstract. And when you, again, get most of your information about this through a third party like the US or Germany or the EU or whatever, there's going to be a lot of cynicism that this is just great power competition. You're trying to make China look bad.
Fair point. Let me ask one last question before we move to the Q&A with our participants. And again, just as a reminder, for those of you who would like online to ask your questions, please write them in the chat box, and we'll collect them here in the room. And for those of us in the room, you can ask them directly. We have the microphone on the table. But let me use the privilege of the moderator to ask you one final question. We talked a lot about the perceptions and the frustrations from the Arab countries or the Middle Eastern countries in general towards China's role and the limitations of that role. Let's look at it the other way around. How do you see, how would Beijing look at the Middle East? I mean, to put it maybe bluntly, is the Middle East important or not for the Middle East, for China? How do you see that in on the agenda of a great power such as China?
Well, I'll preface it by saying, obviously, asking a Canadian what people in Beijing think is, going to be problematic. But I think just looking at it from a geopolitical analyst perspective, any country has limited resources and time and people, for its foreign policy. And again, most countries' foreign policy is going to be kind of lower on the list of priorities because you're busy with a lot of other things at that level. And I think in China, the way that people outside talk about China as this 100-foot giant is really missing out on a lot of what's actually happening inside the country and immediately on the periphery of the country. So obviously things like high youth unemployment seems like, an economic issue, but it's bigger than that. It's something that really undermines the party. For decades, they've used this performance legitimacy as, look, maybe you don't like the party, but we're improving your standard of living. You're getting more opportunities. And an entire generation doesn't believe that's true anymore. You hear about these young people, they're calling it the lying down generation, where they're like, why stand up and work when I can lie down and, take it easy? Or find a blue collar job instead of pushing myself and not get married and not have kids. It's a big deal when you look at things like the Evergrande real estate issue, where this company, the biggest real estate company in a country where real estate is one of the major pillars of their economy. This is a big story. I think Chinese leaders are really, really, really overwhelmingly focused on domestic political issues and economic issues, first and foremost. And then when they're not thinking about that stuff, they're thinking we've got all this regionalism, we've got this rural-urban divide that won't go away, we've got environmental issues, we've got Taiwan, we've got Hong Kong, we've got Xinjiang and Tibet. And then you go outside the country and you see all of these countries they share borders with, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Russia, Mongolia, North Korea, all these these countries that have either problems at home or problems in their relationship with China or their American allies or partners. They've got the Quad, they've got AUKUS. Like, I think when China thinks about foreign policy, they're probably spending a big part of their bandwidth on their immediate periphery, right? The Middle East, like I said, is a place where if you look at what China's done over the past couple of decades, it's a place where they've made money. It's a place where they get energy and where they do contracts and they sell stuff. It's a bonus, right? It's a bonus because they can do it without having to expend a lot of energy. They don't need to send troops. They don't need to have bases. They can kind of use this existing security architecture and go in at a relatively low cost and engage with this region and do a lot of interesting business. But if you look at a lot of their diplomatic energy, it's going to be focusing on those countries where, Japan and Russia and the US and the EU, it's much more important. I think the Middle East fits in a lower band in the hierarchy. There's a book that came out in 2012. I refer to this quite often. Andrew Scobell and Andrew Nathan. The Andrews. It's called China's Search for Security. And they talk about this concentric circle model of looking at China's foreign policy, and they're saying kind of what I just said about, but they do it in a much more elegant way. The inner circle is domestic issues, its region, or its periphery rather, these big regional configurations like Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Oceania. And then the fourth level is everything else. And that's where you find Latin America and the Middle East and Africa. So I don't think the Middle East, it's important, but I don't think the way that we as Middle East specialists think of it is not how Beijing thinks about it, is I guess how I would say it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this, all those responses, a lot of food for thought. And I have already a few questions coming from the chat. Let me ask you the first, and this is a question going back to the Chinese mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The question is, how could China leverage its influence on Saudi Arabia and Iran to resolve the Gaza conflict?
Yeah, doesn't have any.
So that's
no, I mean, it doesn't have leverage in Iran. Iran is looking at Gaza as an existential crisis, right? The region is at a leading up to this, Iran was trying to calm tensions, right? The rapprochement with the Saudis was also in response to the fact that Iran had been going under these, never-ending protests domestically because of these thugs that killed that poor young woman, right? Their domestic situation was horrible, and they're getting, Saudi press constantly feeding people in Iran stories about what Iran's doing wrong, and people were very susceptible to that because they were very frustrated with their own government. So Iran was looking for things to calm down too, much like the Saudis were, so they could, enhance their Vision 2030. But when this started, and it got out of hand very quickly with the October 7th attack, Iran gives so much money to Hamas. It's not necessarily a patron-client relationship or a proxy relationship, but Iran is a major sponsor of Hamas. and then there's Hezbollah, and then there's the Houthis. And you can see Iran's looking at this region and going, if this escalates, we're in serious trouble. And at this point, China comes in and says, hey, the Houthis are raising the cost of shipping in the Red Sea. I don't think Iran cares about that. I think they care more about how do we manage what's going on with Israel and southern Lebanon and Israel and Syria. And China's proven to not be a very active participant in that. So I don't see what leverage China has right now. I think at different points they have had leverage with Iran. Like I said, leading up to the JCPOA, I think, I don't know if leverage, but they had influence. They could say to Iran, here are some positive inducements we could offer you if you see things the same way we see them, But I don't think that's the case right now at all. And I don't think China has any leverage with the Saudis either. I mean, if anybody could influence the Saudis from outside the region, I think it would be the US. I don't think it will be China.
Okay, let me ask the second question. And this is the following. Would you say that, as others have, the single most important lens which China uses to view its relations with Middle Eastern countries is its intensifying rivalry with the US? So is it mostly about the competition with the US?
I think China has always looked at the Middle East across a geopolitical level, this kind of international systemic level, and also within its own interests. So I think there's two levels to look at. I mean, the Cold War is a really good example of how China would look at this region and say, okay, we've got an alliance with the Soviets, and they worked with Soviet clients in the region, and they stayed away from the lackeys or puppets, which is how they saw countries that aligned with the US or the UK or whoever. So their approach to the region in the early days of the Cold War is very much a response to this kind of bipolarity, this kind of geopolitical competition. When their relationship with the Soviets deteriorated, they started to work more closely with countries that were aligned with the US. So I think there has been always this kind of systemic impact. I think, like I said, China's biggest, most consequential relationships in the Middle East are with US allies and partners, whether that's the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Egyptians, I guess would be the big ones. And the stuff they do with countries that are rivals or problems with the US, you don't see a lot of it. Like Iran is the case, I guess, the case everybody looks at. But as I alluded to earlier, China really hasn't done much with Iran. Excuse me. In the past few years, if you look at investment, it's been plummeting. Chinese companies find it a very difficult country to operate in. The IRGC controls the economy basically, so outside companies aren't going to really have much of an opportunity in this environment. And the trades keeps dropping. Everybody's worried about sanctions. There was only one Chinese bank that was operating in Iran. They stopped doing basically everything in 2019, except for the most basic things that couldn't be sanctioned. So I think, yeah, they do look at it through this lens of US competition, but I think I don't think the relationship with the US is everything, because again, they get between 40 and 50% of their energy from the Middle East. They do, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the amount of trade between China and the Arab League countries, plus Israel, Iran, and Turkey was approaching 400 billion last year, I think. It's pretty significant. So they do a lot of stuff for out of their own interests, out of their own, need to be in the region. I think when they think about the region, they do probably use that lens of how does our relationship with the US impact what we're trying to achieve. And it's been interesting because I think a lot of folks who look at it kind of look at it like a chess game and everybody's waiting to see checkmate. And I think that's not the right way to look at it because, Belt and Road. Oh no, the US is on its back foot. And then Abraham Accords. And oh no, China is in trouble. I think really what we're seeing is both countries have a lot of interest in the region. We talked for my podcast, 2 nights ago, about IMEC and how a lot of folks have the same logic saying, oh, well, IMEC it looks like it's going to happen. This is something the US wants. It must be bad for China. I think Beijing will look at it and say, hey, if this IMEC thing works, there's going to be like a port in Oman with a train that goes all the way to Haifa. That's good for us, right? So I think they look at all these things in a lot of different layers. I think the US-China bit, I think what's interesting to me is how local actors see it. Like, hey, when it was the Cold War, if we weren't getting what we wanted from the Soviets, we could talk to the Americans. We didn't like what we were getting from the Americans, we could talk to the Soviets. Cold War ended, there's only one place you could turn, right? Basically to the West. If you want a loan, if you want anything, you've got to go to Washington or London or Paris or whatever, which are all kind of normatively cohesive. And now they can say, hey, look, we've got a lot of different potential partners to work with, and China being the big one with the most ambitious vision for the region. I think countries in the region look at it and say, this is a really great opportunity for us right now.
Thank you very much. Let me go to the third question. And this one relates to the comparison between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Because a lot of the things you discussed with regards to the US presence and Chinese involvement, the trade ties and so on, echo some of the elements that Southeast Asian countries have experienced for a longer time actually than the Middle East. Is there anything that, I mean, first that you would see interesting in the experiences of both the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and also is there anything that Southeast Asia or that the Middle East could learn from the Southeast Asian experience on China?
On China, absolutely. I think in general, I mean, I do an intro to IR class every semester, and it's interesting to hear how my Emirati students talk about the Middle East as this uniquely wretched region of misery. Like no other region is as bad off as we are. And I keep saying, like, okay, I'm an old guy. I was born in 1975. Southeast Asia kind of could lay claim to that around that time. You know, you look at all of the insecurity and the war and the competition in the region, underdevelopment, poverty, and now you think of it as Crazy Rich Asians or honeymoon in Bali. What's the difference? And I keep talking to my students about this, saying, look, you know, things like institutionalized cooperation, you know, something like ASEAN. You've got the GCC, it's toothless. Obviously, it doesn't work. But if you look at how Southeast Asia approached institutionalizing cooperation and building on, you know, those economic relations to build diplomatic relations to ultimately start talking about security cooperation or whatever, it's a pretty good roadmap. And I keep encouraging my students to look more at how ASEAN was established and see if they can draw any lessons from that. In terms of dealing with China, for sure. Like I've said at the beginning, there's not a lot of people in the Gulf or in the Middle East who are thinking seriously about China. When I was in Israel at one of these discussion forums, an Israeli participant said, I've got the feeling that the Chinese think about us a lot more than we think about them. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty good working assumption. Because of that, I think it's really useful for Middle Eastern students, governments, analysts, journalists, whatever, to talk to people like the Singaporeans or the Filipinos or the Vietnamese or other countries that have this kind of experience. Because a lot of what you see in Gulf media, especially about China, is often stuff that has been pulled from the People's Daily or from the, you know, Renmin Herbao or whatever, that's been reported in Chinese about the Middle East, and then it's translated into Arabic and just run, you know, published in the Gulf News or whatever. There's not a lot of critical thinking about what China's saying in these cases, and that would be a valuable thing. So to talk to folks from this region to say, not in a negative way, but to say, look, we're not sure how to interpret some of this stuff. We don't have the experience you have. What does this mean? A lot of the stuff that I think people who don't study China formally when you hear about, these three represents, or, Xi Jinping thought on socialist rejuvenation, and all this stuff, people are like, I don't know what this means, like, because we don't study it. So could you help us try to understand how this fits in with the bigger picture, and how this might affect us ultimately? I would love to see more dialogue, especially among students or think tanks or whatever, say from the MEI and different institutions, and with students and Abu Dhabi. I think it'd be a fantastic opportunity, because they need to build that muscle, and it hasn't really been happening yet.
But just to follow up on this, because you earlier said that there wasn't like a big academic environment dedicated to Chinese studies in the Middle East, and maybe more specifically in the Gulf here. Did you see an evolution, at least something? I mean, especially in the UAE where you are based, do you see signs that, I don't know, not just on strategic studies, but language skills, something that would indicate that this is actually coming, that there is more and more a local community dedicated to Chinese studies?
Well, definitely with the language. So in 2019, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's now the president, but at the time was Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, he went to Beijing and they signed this agreement. They signed a lot of MOUs, but one of them was to bring Chinese language study into the K-12 national curriculum. And it started as a very small pilot program, and I think now it's a majority of the public schools in the UAE have a Chinese language classes. So you can imagine, say, in 12 years, you're going to start to see people that are more culturally aware about China, linguistically aware about China. But I will say, I talked to an acquaintance who teaches in the program, and when I asked this teacher, how is it going? Are the students enthusiastic? And the teacher said, I work so hard and nobody appreciates it. Nobody takes us seriously. They say, we already have to learn English and that's hard enough, and now we have to learn Chinese and we don't understand why. And so I think it's going to be an uphill battle, really, because if they implemented a K-12 Korean program in the public schools in the UAE, it would be so popular, because everybody's watching K-pop and everybody loves, the Netflix dramas and things. And this is an interesting thing to me, is China's soft power doesn't travel. Like its popular culture is created in a Marxist-Leninist framework. And it's also created in a market with 1.4 billion people. So if you don't stream a lot of stuff in other countries, you're still going to be doing pretty good, right? So a lot of the stuff that travels to the Gulf just doesn't resonate. It's not really attractive or appealing. They like anime, they like manga, they like, hip hop, whatever. They don't like hip hop songs about the Belt and Road or Xi Jinping, which, honest to God, we saw a few years ago. Tell me what Xi Jinping's up to with the BRI. Yo.
Interesting. Maybe we will have a special event on that. For sure, we'll Google that right after the event.
That sounded suspiciously like you trying to stop me from rapping on a webinar.
No, we
probably
it's on the report, by the way.
I should thank you.
We have a few minutes left for questions, if there are any questions left. I see some questions actually coming on the chat box. My apologies. Let me so ASEAN, okay. So that's actually not directly related to China, but more on Asia Gulf relations. The fact that ASEAN held its first summit with the GCC last year. So we have a question on that specific topic. If you think there are any cause for optimism that could lead to anything, quote.
Yeah, I always think there's cause for optimism. I mean, my favorite baseball team hasn't won the championship since 1993, so you have to be optimistic. In terms of ASEAN or Asia and the Gulf in general, I mean, I've been working on this book about the UAE's Asian engagement for a while now. You can see that in a lot of pretty significant ways. Indonesia has become a really serious actor for the UAE. There's been a lot of high-level meetings and lots of investment and lots of trade and lots of just cooperation across the board. I think it's one thing, obviously we're here to talk about China, but a lot of Asian countries do a lot of interesting stuff in the Gulf. I lived in Korea for 5 years. I didn't think that my Korean experience would really be that important when I moved to the Emirates, but there's a huge Korean community since Korea helped build the civil nuclear power plant in the UAE. There's been this corresponding huge influx of Korean nationals living there. As I said, lots of soft power. Japan is a major actor. India is so important and doesn't really get talked about a whole lot in the Gulf. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff just happening across the spectrum of Gulf Asia, Southeast Asia relations. Singapore is considered a strategic partner for the UAE, so they do a lot of pretty significant stuff together as well.
Let me ask you two. We'll start with one question. Let me check the time. First question, which relates to the economic support of China for Arab nations like Egypt and Jordan in the long term, particularly in light of the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. The question is, Egypt's reliance on IMF aid hinders its ability to assist Palestinians to their full potential. So I'm reading the question so if I rephrase it, do you see any role for China in supporting the economies of Arab states such as Egypt and Jordan that may already today and maybe after the war struggle with their own issues and the reconstruction of Gaza? I assume that's the way the question is framed.
Right. So Egypt would probably be the most likely, if any. With Jordan, I've got this spreadsheet on my computer where I'm looking at what China's doing with different Middle Eastern countries, and Jordan never really comes up very much. And I assume that that's largely because Jordan is like Israel, deeply reliant on the US for a lot of stuff. And probably they look at China and think, well, why antagonize our most important partner for something that may not pay out too much. So I don't know if there were to be some kind of specific economic support for Jordan in the on the Gaza issue or the West Bank issue, perhaps, but we haven't seen that before. With Egypt, I just think in general, Egypt, like I said earlier, their economy is really, really troubled. And China is one of those countries that they've been turning to a lot over the past few years. They'll probably continue to do that. How the Gaza situation will play into it. There's a lot of domestic political issues in Egypt that are preventing it from engaging on this, right? You know far better than me because you worked on this stuff a lot longer than I have, but I don't think the Egyptian government response to this has been purely, driven by economic issues. I think that the idea of having, a lot of refugees pour into their country is not especially appealing.
Another question, which is a bit of a follow-up, but which is more on the Chinese-Palestinian relations. And you mentioned earlier the meeting between Xi Jinping and Mahmoud Abbas. The question is the fact that there has been a recent signing of a strategic partnership pact between China and the Palestinian Authority. The participant acknowledges the fact that this is by no means as big as what China has with Israel. But considering, quote, China's assertive stance since October 7, portraying itself as the champion of the Palestinian rights, do you think, we can envision China jeopardizing its partnership with Israel to champion Palestinian rights on the international stage when viewed through the lens of Chinese interests, end of quote?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of what China's done. I think they've realized that Israel is going to trade with China no matter what. They're not going to like it, but they're going to trade with them. Most of the other bigger stuff is probably going to tail off. China hasn't been getting any big critical infrastructure deals with Israel. it's things like helping build a subway or helping build a port. But the stuff that China wants to achieve, to be seen as the go-to provider for that bigger, more substantial stuff, they're not going to get it with Israel. So I think they look at it, Palestine, and say, look, we can champion Palestine, we can offer rhetorical support, and it could be more than this. It could actually be a useful actor in this space. I think the idea that we heard a lot of before October 7th, the idea that China could play some kind of mediator role, because that was something that China had been stressing as itself as a mediator. Well, that doesn't exist anymore in the Palestine Israel issue, because they've lost all credibility with the Israelis. But that doesn't mean that they can't have some kind of active role in this. They could work with the Palestinians and other regional actors to try to kind of on the outside of things, try to get more for Palestine than what other extra regional actors are willing to. They could be useful, but I don't think they're going to really be central.
And I believe this will be the last question, except if there's anybody left. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Jonathan. Obviously, this is to be continued. The topic is such that probably in 6 months from now, we'll have many different ways to look at it. Thank you for all our listeners, our participants, for their questions, for their attendance. This is all for today. Thank you again, Jonathan, and my apologies again for the logistical issue at the beginning of the webinar. It was a great pleasure to have you here. You're always welcome to the Middle East Institute, especially if you want to organize a rap concert on the Belt and Road Initiative. That can be an idea for another event. Thank you all, and have a great weekend ahead.
Thanks, everyone.